Welcome to the debate. Imagine a piece of machinery that took, 10,000 years to build.
Okay.
It operates perfectly on just sunshine and rain. It naturally filters our water, and it literally feeds the world.
Yeah. It's an incredible system.
Right. Now imagine parking an 800-acre industrial power plant right on top of it, just to solve a 30-year energy crisis. Today we're looking at a debate that is tearing a Kentucky community apart.
It really is.
And it's a perfect microcosm of the friction at the heart of the global energy transition.
When you drive through Fayette County, Kentucky, and, look out over those rolling bluegrass fields, there is an expectation of permanence. We understand exactly how that biological machine works, right?
Absolutely. It's been operating the same way for centuries.
Exactly. But when you introduce utility-scale solar arrays, you are fundamentally changing the physics of the landscape. You are swapping a biological harvest for an industrial one. And, well, the consequences of that shift are incredibly profound.
And that tension is exactly why we are here today, April 24th, 2026. We are tracking a fast-moving, high-stakes policy debate in Lexington regarding a proposed zoning ordinance text amendment, often just called a ZOTA.
Right, a ZOTA.
Yeah. And for those unfamiliar with the term, a ZOTA is basically a process for changing the rulebook of what you're legally allowed to build on a specific piece of land. This particular amendment would allow large-scale solar energy systems in Fayette County's agricultural rural and agricultural urban zones.
And, this debate has very immediate, tangible deadlines. Like this coming Tuesday, April 28th, the full council work session will be taking this up.
Which is coming up fast.
Very fast. This all stems from a highly controversial March 10th vote by the General Government and Planning Committee. By a narrow 6-4 margin, they voted to advance what are called conditional use permits for solar farms larger than 5 acres.
Right.
And that vote was a total reversal from just last September, when the council effectively banned large-scale solar on this exact same farmland.
I'll be taking the position that advancing these conditional use permits is a vital, well-regulated mechanism to generate necessary renewable energy. Crucially, a conditional use permit isn't a permanent rezoning. It means the land stays agricultural on paper, but the county grants a highly specific, easily revocable exception, as long as strict rules are followed. It allows us to utilize private land for grid power while still maintaining agricultural conditions.
I will be arguing against the proposal. I am asserting that this amendment threatens irreversible damage to irreplaceable prime soil. Furthermore, it stems from a fundamentally flawed, exclusionary legislative process that prioritized corporate developers over the local agricultural experts who actually understand the land.
Let's lay out our core positions to start. We cannot ignore the reality of our grid requirements and our carbon footprint. Integrating utility-scale solar is no longer a luxury, right? It is essential infrastructure.
Sure, the need for renewable energy is real.
Right. But the key here is the mechanism of how Lexington is proposing to do it. The proposed conditional use permit is not a free pass for developers to pave over the bluegrass. It is a strong, balanced safeguard.
A safeguard?
Yes. It mandates continued farming on site, it requires rigorous annual inspections, and it dictates that at least 85% of the ground under the solar panels must remain vegetated. Allowing private entities like the Nashville-based Silicon Ranch,
Which is backed by Shell, by the way.
yes, backed by Shell, to develop projects like the proposed 800-acre Haley Road solar farm is a pragmatic use of agricultural rural zones. Importantly, we're talking about land that isn't currently being utilized for Fayette County's signature equine operations. It gives landowners the right to utilize their acreage for utility-scale energy generation under some of the strictest conditions imaginable.
Well, I come at it from a different way. We have to look at this strictly through the lens of land conservation and procedural integrity, both of which are failing here.
How so?
98%, I think 98.06% exactly, of the proposed solar sites sit directly on USDA-designated prime farmland, or soils of statewide significance.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. We are talking about the absolute best combination of physical and chemical characteristics for producing food. And the process that drafted these rules to build over that soil is deeply broken.
In what way?
The solar work group that created these recommendations consisted of exactly 4 council members meeting behind closed doors. They excluded the Fayette County Farm Bureau. They excluded UK Extension.
Oh, really?
Yes. The USDA National Resource Conservation Service, the exact experts the county relies on for soil recommendations, were completely shut out. We are risking our most vital natural resource based on an exclusionary process.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the relationship between solar infrastructure and the soil itself.
Okay.
We need to evaluate the mechanics of the dual-use conditions written into this proposal. The requirement that 85% of the ground must remain vegetated, combined with the mandate for continued farming, creates a symbiotic relationship. Usually, this takes the form of rotational sheep grazing or shade-tolerant crop cultivation beneath the panels.
But how does industrial infrastructure create a symbiosis with delicate topsoil? I mean, that doesn't track.
Because you have to think of this highly regulated solar integration like a long-term fallow period for the land.
A fallow period?
Yeah. In traditional agriculture, a farmer will let a field lie fallow, resting it from the intense, repetitive cycles of tilling, planting, and harvesting. Those cycles rapidly deplete soil nutrients and require massive chemical inputs.
Sure.
In this solar scenario, the acreage is actively harvesting sunshine for the grid to meet our critical energy needs, but the soil itself is preserved. It's anchored by that mandated 85% vegetation cover which prevents erosion. It's protected from the heavy chemical fertilizers of intensive row cropping, and it's allowed to rest.
I see the logic, but
And when the 30-year life cycle of the solar farm ends, the infrastructure is removed and you have preserved the land for future agricultural use.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. That fallow analogy fundamentally breaks down when you look at the actual engineering mechanics of industrial solar. A fallow field is resting peacefully. An 800-acre industrial solar site is a massive, heavy construction zone.
Well, during construction, sure.
Right, but the USDA explicitly defines prime farmland based on a delicate profile of physical and chemical properties, moisture supply, deep soil structure, drainage capacity. When a company like Silicon Ranch comes in, they aren't gently setting glass panels on top of the grass.
They are driving steel pylons into the ground, yes, which has a localized physical footprint.
It is so much more than a localized footprint. Consider the entire construction apparatus. It requires extensive trenching for miles and miles of underground electrical cables to tie those panels together.
Okay, there is trenching.
And it involves heavy machinery, massive construction cranes, fully loaded material trucks, heavy grading equipment rolling constantly over delicate topsoil. This causes severe deep soil compaction. When you compact soil to that degree, you destroy the microscopic pore space in the earth that holds water and oxygen.
But
Once you crush that deep soil architecture, water runs off instead of infiltrating, taking the topsoil with it. The 85% vegetation rule is a superficial metric. Sure, you might have some grass growing on the surface to satisfy an inspector, but the deep soil hydrology that actually makes it prime farmland is irreparably altered. You simply cannot equate heavy industrial utility construction with an agricultural resting period.
But we must acknowledge the realities of standard modern farming, Traditional agricultural practices also involve heavy machinery. Massive combine harvesters, heavy tractors, and loaded grain carts routinely cause deep soil compaction.
Right, but
The critical difference here is the frequency. Agricultural compaction happens every single season, year after year. Solar installation compaction happens exactly once during the construction phase. After that, the land is left largely undisturbed for 20 or 30 years, save for light maintenance vehicles and grazing sheep.
still, the initial damage is done.
Furthermore, these conditional use permits require comprehensive, fully bonded decommissioning plans to restore the land.
Look, a piece of paper outlining a decommissioning plan can't uncompact a subsoil profile that took 10,000 years of glacial movement and biological decay to form. The timeline contrast here is what makes this so critical.
I mean, 30 years is a long time for it to recover.
We are trading a permanent 10,000-year biological resource for a 30-year energy lease. Because you can't just uncompact that deep soil, we have to ask ourselves, why are we even looking at pristine farmland in the first place when we have millions of square feet of dead space in our cities?
Ah, so you're referring to prioritizing the built environment.
Exactly. The American Farmland Trust, an organization the solar work group supposedly consulted, explicitly outlines best practices for solar siting. Their primary recommendation is to prioritize solar on the built environment, on land not well suited for farming, and on brownfields.
The brownfields, right.
Yeah, and for clarity, a brownfield is previously developed land that might have some industrial contamination, making it perfect for solar because you can't farm it anyway. Look at the examples highlighted in the local Lexington discourse. The Locust Trace Agri-Science Campus is a net zero school entirely powered by smart, localized solar integration.
It's a great project.
It is. The Denver Public School System is reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 90% using rooftop panels and solar carports. Evansville, Indiana, installed solar canopies over their airport parking lots that offset 50% of the airport's power. The physical space is there.
Sure, it's there, but
We should exhaust our commercial spaces, our warehouse rooftops, and our vast seas of asphalt parking lots before we even consider sacrificing 800 acres of prime soil off Haley Road.
If you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, that makes perfect sense. Why don't we just put the panels on the roofs in the bad soil? But I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it ignores the actual engineering and grid physics of utility-scale energy generation.
How so?
We have to look at how power is transmitted. Are we letting the perfect be the enemy of the good? Rooftop solar and parking canopies are excellent, and we absolutely should pursue them aggressively. But piecemeal decentralized urban projects are incredibly complex to integrate into the grid.
They are more complex, yes.
Trying to collect energy from 10,000 different grocery store roofs requires a massive, complex web of localized inverters, extensive neighborhood grid upgrades, and endless right-of-way negotiations.
But it preserves the soil.
It does, but it cannot match the immediate centralized grid impact of an 800-acre facility. An industrial solar farm acts as a single massive power plant. It collects all that energy in one place, steps up the voltage at a single dedicated substation, and plugs directly into a high-voltage transmission line.
I understand the efficiency argument, but
We do not have the time or the infrastructure funding to knit together a decentralized urban grid to meet our immediate carbon reduction goals. Silicon Ranch's proposal isn't meant to power a single school. It's utility-scale power meant to reinforce the entire regional energy grid. We are facing an urgent climate timeline. We cannot afford the friction of waiting for perfect urban integration when we have the rural land capacity to act now.
But at what long-term cost to local food security and agricultural heritage?
Fayette County is vast. We have the land capacity to support both agriculture and energy. None of the acreage currently proposed is being used for the county's signature equine operations.
Even so, it's prime soil.
If a private landowner looks at the economics of their farm, looks at the rising costs of traditional agriculture, and decides that participating in the clean energy transition provides them with vital, reliable income to keep the farm in their family, they should have the avenue to pursue it, provided they meet the stringent annual inspection requirements of the conditional use permit, of course.
Right, the permit.
We aren't abandoning agriculture. We are diversifying how our rural land produces value in a modern economy.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered how we arrived at these supposedly stringent requirements? Because we cannot separate the final policy from the process that birthed it. You claim these regulations are carefully balanced safeguards, but the democratic process and community engagement behind them have been shockingly poor.
Well, I wouldn't call it shockingly poor.
This isn't just about a zoning debate in Kentucky. This is a microcosm of how the green energy transition is actually happening on the ground across the country. We are seeing well-funded corporations dictating baseline zoning text behind closed doors while local farmers are left playing defense.
That's a strong accusation. The process has involved multiple layers of municipal government.
Let's look at the actual mechanics of that government process, specifically the March 10 committee vote. It was a narrow 6-4 decision, and even the council members who advanced it expressed deep reservations on the record.
They debated it, yes.
Council member Hill Boone explicitly stated, "I can't support what came out of the committee." Council member Chuck Ellinger admitted, "There are some holes in it."
They were acknowledging the complexity of the issue, which is what good lawmakers do when facing a tough compromise.
They were acknowledging a fundamentally flawed product. Fayette Alliance Director Brittany Rothmere pointed out exactly why it's flawed, and it goes back to the origin of the text. The 4-member solar work group operated without public access. The meeting notes show they invited the local labor union and the sheep producers, but they intentionally excluded the Fayette County Farm Bureau.
They were trying to get a baseline draft done.
They excluded active producers of cattle and crops. They excluded the very agricultural experts that the Rural Land Management Board relies on. When you have a corporation like Silicon Ranch, where Shell is the largest shareholder, pushing for these tax amendments, they have endless resources to navigate local government. How can you claim a policy balances agriculture and energy when the community's agricultural experts were quite literally locked out of the room where the rules were written?
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. You are portraying the March 10 committee vote as if it acted like a final closed-door ruling that completely bypassed the public.
It certainly feels that way to the farmers.
In reality, the mechanics of local government require momentum to tackle massive issues. That committee vote acted more like a one-way valve. It pushed the ordinance out of an endless drafting phase and into the arena of actual comprehensive public review.
Okay.
As Councilmember Emma Curtis rightly pointed out, moving this out of committee takes the discussion out of legislative limbo and puts it into a more productive place.
A productive place where the public is limited to 3 minutes of comment at a work session?
A productive place where the process now demands rigorous structural evaluation. Because it passed out of committee, the proposal now faces a mandatory 60-day review period and a dedicated public hearing by the Planning Commission.
Right, the 60-day window.
Beyond that, the policy recommendations are being sent to the Rural Land Management Board and the Environmental Commission for their official expert feedback. This isn't circumventing the experts. This is the exact moment the experts and the public are structurally brought in to scrutinize, amend, and perfect the ordinance. The democratic checks and balances are functioning exactly as intended.
But
they're functioning to refine this ZODA before any final council vote happens this summer. The work group just created the starting block. Is the text perfect right now? No. Will it be altered over the next 60 days? Almost certainly.
I understand the timeline you're laying out, but the foundation absolutely matters. If the foundational text of the amendment was drafted without the input of the USDA, NRCS, or local farmers, the Planning Commission is now forced to react to a flawed baseline rather than building a smart policy from the ground up.
Well, they have 60 days to fix it.
But the burden shouldn't be on the citizens and local farmers to fix a broken, industry-friendly proposal in a tight 60-day window. The burden should have been on the work group to include the right people from day one.
I mean, process is always messy.
It is not procedural purism to demand that when you are deciding the fate of 98% prime agricultural soil, a resource that cannot be manufactured or replaced once it is destroyed by industrial trenching, you must have the soil experts in the room from the very first meeting.
I think that brings us perfectly to the core friction of this debate. We have to balance the ideal process against the very real, ticking clock of our energy grid needs. Let's summarize where we stand as we look toward the critical April 28th Council work session.
Sure.
My position remains that conditional use permits for large-scale solar offer a vital, strictly regulated pathway forward. By demanding